Douglas Murray, thanks for joining us. I appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure.
You are author and journalist. I mean, we can see The Madness of Crowds and The Strange Death of Europe both behind you there.
Product placement.
Perfect. And I think potentially in The Madness of Crowds, and actually also The Strange Death of Europe, I think there will be room for us to discuss the subject matter in those books around and in relation to coronavirus. I'd like to start with quite a broad question, which is how you think coronavirus will change our world, both for our country and more broadly, the globe.
Well, the first thing is to say that I think you'd have to be a fool to make predictions about this. Very few people talked about this subject, saw it coming, or could possibly have seen the situation we're now in. When we last met, I think, in person, maybe 9 months ago when we spoke, I think neither of us would have expected that we would be in this complete, lockdown. I don't think anyone else did either. So I think a certain sort of humility is required. If we didn't expect this, let's be humble about our predictions and expectations going forward. There are various ways in which you can see this. Some people say, like Ben Gummer, the former MP who wrote a history of the Black Death some years ago, wrote recently saying, actually, these things don't change that much in a society. It stops and then the society keeps going as it was before. Some people take that attitude towards major pandemics and similar catastrophes. Others say, well, no, actually, there are significant changes that happen. I mean, somebody pointed out the other day, we still, well, this isn't exactly a significant change, but we still say bless you when somebody sneezes from a plague of 5 centuries ago. So of course, they have some kind of effect. The problem with it is, the problem with prediction on this is, that it's impossible to see which way it could fall out. I mean, there are certain things that we're doing now, certain things that have already massively changed in our societies. But perhaps when we're allowed out again, we'll go back to what we were doing before. The other thing I point out is there's an enormous temptation, which we're all prone to, whatever people's politics. There's an enormous temptation to use something like this as a sort of metastasizing force for whatever your own political viewpoint happened to be. I've been keeping a sort of small notebook in recent weeks of people who've never written about pandemics, never thought about them, never written about China, never particularly thought about it, but who find that coronavirus miraculously just vindicates all the things that they were saying before. You can see people from every political direction doing this. This virus has come along, and that is why I was right all along about totally unrelated things. So I just urge people not to fall into those grooves. This is very unusual. It's unprecedented in our lifetimes, and it probably will have some effects, but it's very early to call what they might be.
It's absolutely, I mean, the business of prediction is essentially can be a fool's errand, but I would offer that it's hard to imagine the hyper-globalized world that we used to inhabit with, these extended supply chains still existing. I think also on sort of the level of the worker, I think a lot of people who have been, constrained to their homes and now working from home are probably going to have the realization that a lot of their work can probably be completed in a couple of hours, and that the rest of the time they spend, I think there's going to be a real realization of perhaps efficiency and also the meaning of work for people.
It could be, but I mean, we were talking about this 20 years ago before this pandemic. I mean, and in the dawn of the internet, this was meant to happen. I mean, remember in the late 90s onwards, there was already enormous literature on people saying, this is why we're all going to work from home in future. And it didn't happen. Of course, we've sort of got used a bit more. I'm a writer. I'm used to working from home. I'm used to being on my own. But of course, most people who work in offices and things have become more used to this virtual world. But who's to say that they won't therefore relish being back in the office and relish, company outside their immediate family? Maybe it will happen like that. Maybe it won't. As for the globalization point, I mean, I think we have to be careful about this. I think, yes, in terms of supply chains, there will probably be more of a public urge, a public wish for us to be able to have faster, swifter access to vital products and to be in a greater control ourselves, or at least more easily able to access particularly medicines. And it'll be easier for people to make that argument than it was a few months ago. But other aspects of globalization, I can't especially see people giving up on. I mean, after the end of the lockdown, I don't think that people are going to be less reluctant than before to go abroad, for instance. Wouldn't there be more of an urge to get back to doing that, to traveling for work as well as for pleasure? I would have thought that sort of aspect of it will just go back to normal. But this is the problem with the term globalization. It means an awful lot of things.
Yeah, of course. And I think, particularly in relation to international travel, I think it may well end up being a case of expense, the collapse of these airlines. But moving on, I'd like to touch on what we're learning about our country, what we're learning about ourselves in this moment. You wrote recently about trust, national trust, you described it as. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I wrote about this in The Spectator. I've been very struck by this, and I think this is a point that hasn't been made enough. We in Britain have been living in a country which in recent years has been said to be, a divided country, a divided society. We were meant to be incredibly low on trust. We were meant to be distrustful of all institutions from the police and parliament to the monarchy and much more, were said to have, lost public trust. At various points it goes up and down, but we've been reading this. Some of us have been writing bits of that for years. And I'm very struck, among other things, by the fact that in recent weeks, the British public turn out not to have lost trust in all institutions, but to have been quietly storing it away even while we pretended otherwise. So, when our leading scientists gave their presentations to the nation, very few people said, we don't trust the scientists. We've got our own views. Now, we might come on to that. There are people, fringes, admittedly, there are people trying to invent their own science, among other things, at the moment. But by and large, we listened to the scientists and we were concerned, persuaded, if you like. The Prime Minister, not beloved of the entire country in recent years, was said to be a highly divisive figure and all that sort of thing. But, broadly speaking, the British people, we trusted him. We do trust him, I think. We do believe he's trying to do his best, and that the government are trying to do their best, and that's very striking to me. Look at the warmth and affection with which the Queen's message to the nation was received. Now, again, the monarchy as an institution has, up until recent months, been very easy to sort of laugh at and deride, but it has turned out to be a receptacle, an important receptacle of memory as well as trust. And as I say, what strikes me about this is that a society that thought that we didn't trust anyone turns out to have had trust in institutions and indeed in experts. And now that isn't the case in every country. I mean, I think what we're seeing in America at the moment is a demonstration of this, that, American politics still, even now, even facing this pandemic, cannot rid itself of the pro or anti-Trump prism. Everything has to be seen through that. And I mean, I think that's a tragedy for American society, but that isn't a tragedy, fortunately, that Britain has at the moment.
There's a couple of points there that I think we'll come back to later on, particularly institutions in American politics. But I think the point there you mentioned that I'd like to explore a little bit more now is memory, because in the Queen's address, she linked, didn't she? She called back to her broadcast during the Second World War. Which I think was very powerful, and obviously as well the sign-off, "We will meet again," a reference to Vera Lynn, which was the anthem during that time. Yeah. But I am cautious about invoking the sort of the Second World War metaphor, because I think
Well, we're sitting on our asses at home, not storming the beaches of Normandy. You've noticed.
Yes, yeah, I think that might be obvious to the viewer. But it's useful. It's useful to employ that language and to make those references. They are a simple and easily understandable call for national solidarity. But at the moment, I think, the struggle, if you like, against this virus. I mean, it's closer to a tragedy, isn't it, than a sort of heroic, Dunkirk, Normandy type moment. I almost feel like it's a case of succumbing and accepting and putting our faith in the science and the medicine. And there's not really this bravado, if you like. And I wonder how constructive it is.
Well, I mean, this point's been made many times, but of course the Second World War analogy is useful because Britain and indeed most of the Western democracies have been running off the residual capital of World War II unity for 8 decades now, and that's because that was Jonathan Haidt, among other things, has made this point about American politics. It's about the only thing you can still unite people about. We were on the right side then, so pretty much everyone agrees on that, even in America. And so that when you do have these moments of unity, you do need to run off them for a time if they're of utility, and that's what's happening there. Yes, obviously, as I point out, that I think that you can hark back to these things as times when we've also been united. But that isn't to want. It would be outrageous to put ourselves in the bracket of that in a way. There is a terrible passivity about this, but nevertheless, there is something slightly, quietly heroic about it. Everyone's given up quite a bit of their liberty. We will all have given up on a significant amount to all of our earnings. And many people will be much impoverished by this. We all will be in some way. If it turns out that was the price necessary to duck the worst of this, and if we have indeed ducked it, then doubtless there'll be lots of people who said it wouldn't have happened anyway. But I think there is something quietly heroic about people's doing that. It's as I say, it's an act of passivity, admittedly, but it does rely on it does show some residual fortitude, I think, and of course there is the fact that among people in the country are people who are behaving heroically. I'm thinking of those people in the NHS and elsewhere who are having to turn up to work and are risking their health, certainly in many cases, sadly, their lives, to do their job. And there is a heroism in that, certainly.
So interesting to mention the economic impact. I spoke to Peter Hitchens last week, and his argument is that essentially it's disproportionate, and that the cure may be worse than the disease itself. But
that's the case if we duck the disease.
Yeah,
I relish plurality of debate and ideas, and so I'm always delighted when people say things and argue things and write things that I'm in disagreement with. But I do think that Peter Hitchens' point, relies on us not having bursting hospital wards and people dying outside hospitals in very large numbers. And so long as that's the case, then again it would be possible to say that the cure is worse than the disease. But that's only possible if you duck the disease, which is what obviously in Britain and other countries are trying to do at the moment.
Yes, and remains to be seen. But the other way of looking at plague is as a great leveller, isn't it? Walter Scheidel, I think actually potentially a Spectator US colleague of yours, he argues that plagues are one of the few things that actually can reduce inequality by virtue of, without getting too morbid about it, all of a sudden the workforce is, wages increase, there's fewer workers around. Do you think this is a great leveller? Is it possible to make that call at this time?
Well, not to be flippant about it, but death is the great leveller in general, and we're all going to succumb to it at some point. This is not an original observation. Now, large catastrophes, that's true, can have this effect. I think there are several things to point out about this. Again, there is a risk in this of us hearing what we want to hear. I just put it out there. There's been a great debate in recent years, particularly coming from the political left. The French author and economist Piketty and others, have brought the issue of inequality to the fore, and there is a risk that some people say, well, in fact, it happened. The BBC's Newsnight presenter, Emily Maitlis, weirdly, I think last week, went on a totally, I think, first ever sort of American news style anchorman sermon to the audience. Not an introduction, but a sermon of this is what we need to do, this is what we need to learn, sort of thing. And inevitably talked about inequality and how after the coronavirus we've got to tackle inequality. And I put that in the bucket of don't do that stuff. Certainly don't do it yet. In the immediate aftermath of this, all sorts of things can happen. There might be all sorts of things we should address. I mean, the first thing is to be better prepared for a pandemic like this happening again, which it almost certainly will. But when I hear people talking about things like, can this make us a more equal society? I think just hold your horses a bit. Let's get through this. And then, but as I say, there's something ugly about using pandemics to argue a political point. I mean, we've had one that interests me, of course, because I wrote about it in The Madness of Crowds, was the use of identity politics to go riding across everything. And we've seen in recent weeks, I mean, I thought at the beginning of this pandemic, well, at least those people will shut up for a bit. Well, it was a matter of hours. They remained quiet. And then, we got the usual things, the people who wanted to accentuate, war between the sexes, started arguing that women were more at risk from coronavirus than men, and then the stats showed the opposite, but they didn't shut up about that. They just said, well, more men might be dying, but it's women who are suffering. There have been really ugly attempts to racialize this. People saying that ethnic minorities suffer more, therefore, using quite often very easy to refute statistics to do that stuff. Very early on, there were reports, saying things like the BBC ran this, was how difficult it is in coronavirus for gay people who have homophobic parents. Well, sure, but it is difficult for straight people who find their parents irritating. And, why are we doing this? So there has been quite a lot of that. My hope is that all these things, all these attempts to politicize from every direction just dampen down a bit. They have dampened down a bit. But just that we sort of stick with that. It's not interesting to keep dividing people at a time like this. And I'm sort of enthused by the fact that there isn't much appetite for that stuff, and that broadly speaking, we're more interested in unity to get through this than in the people who'd wish to divide us, along class lines or economic lines or racial lines or sex lines or anything else.
It is a fact, isn't it, that BAME people are disproportionately dying during the course of this pandemic. We can discuss that in more detail if you'd like, but on the Maitlis point, I actually found her monologue quite powerful. I found it quite moving, and I wonder if you did, or that's not the case at all. No,
it didn't do anything for me, and I thought that it shouldn't, and I just didn't think it was the place of Emily Maitlis, who's a fine journalist and I admire, but I don't think it's... Look, one thing that's very striking of the polling that's been done, we talked earlier about trust, is the fact that of all the institutions in Britain that have seen, almost all have seen a rise in public trust in them. The monarchy, parliament, politicians, politics, The NHS, obviously, the one that's seen a massive fall in trust is the media, and that there are lots of reasons for that, but people should really in the media should look to themselves on this and think maybe there's a reason for this. And I think one reason is we don't consume the media in order to be morally improved by journalists. And I can tell you, by the way, from much personal experience, if you wanted moral improvement, journalists would not be the place to go. We make very bad sermons. But one reason that public trust has declined is that there is a sense that the media doesn't know what it's doing in this phase, didn't see this coming, and hasn't responded very well to it. Has continued with silly media games that we've been playing for years, gotcha journalism, who's up, who's down, why haven't we seen this person for a few days? Is there a divide between this scientist and this minister, and how this sort of stuff? And there doesn't seem to be much appetite for it in the public, which I'm pleased with, because I don't think there should be. But again, one of the other reasons for this is that this whole idea that the media is there to morally improve us, and that we require moral direction from the presenter of Newsnight, for instance, is a deep mistake. I think it's a category error, and I really do not think it is the role of journalists in that position. I'm not talking here about opinion journalists or columnists, but of allegedly impartial people to say this is what we have to do as a society to change after this. I don't think it's their role. Very quickly on the point you raised about BME deaths, this is disputed. Again, I sort of think I don't really want to dwell on it because the whole thing is divisive. But one important thing is, of course, is that in the UK, if it is the case, in the UK, this to a great extent will have to do with the fact that there is such a high proportion of BME people in London, and that London is the megacity in the UK most affected by the virus. And if I can't remember what the figure is now. Some people say it's around 40% of people in London are categorized as BME. Well, that means that if the major outbreak center is London, then people of those backgrounds are going to be seen on a national average to be disproportionately suffering. But as I say, I sort of would skip over it because it's so ugly that anyone would use it for political purposes. I mean, there have been those who in recent days have been saying, the video that just came out today actually has been going around online of, immigrants who work in the National Health Service, and therefore Britain's immigration policy has to open up after this. And I just think, how enormously convenient for you if that was your view beforehand. Immigrants, it's true, work in the National Health Service, and immigrants, it's true, use the National Health Service. And amazing doctors are trained in the UK, and amazing doctors are trained abroad. But why would you use a virus to dictate your immigration policy? I mean, I would have thought it would be regarded as really poor manners and really morally low to use the coronavirus to point out the number of people of ethnic minorities using the NHS, for instance. I mean, don't do that now, for God's sake. And so don't do the positive and don't do the negative of it. Try to stay focused on the things that aren't just your pet campaigning things. But that seems to be harder than people realize.
On this subject of institutional revival, it was a weekend at the beginning of this month, extraordinary, not least because it was the weekend that Boris Johnson was hospitalised. But you've already mentioned the Queen's address to the nation. We've discussed that already. New leader in the Labour Party, potentially this revival of the official opposition being, the effective check and balance that it's meant to serve in our constitution. And then conversely, I feel like these Downing Street press conferences have sort of been these moribund moments almost of decay, both in the media and potentially the government. I wonder, your assessment of those, or the sort of those daily diktats, and then the question answer sessions afterwards. What your assessment of them has been? I mean, you mentioned gotcha journalism already.
Yeah, I mean, well, firstly, I feel sorry for Keir Starmer, who's a distinguished figure, and I'm sure will lead the Labour Party as well as it can be led at the moment. But I mean, I don't think anyone cares very much. I mean, it's. Who cared who was being appointed to the shadow cabinet? There's nothing less important at the moment. I mean, we're all trying to keep an eye on our loved ones and keep them safe, and and get through this. I mean, Starmer is deeply it just doesn't appear on the radar of concerns for me, and I think that's probably the case for most people. The press conferences, I think, as I say, the interesting thing is that look, we've got to be humble about this. As I said, the people who studied pandemics were, until very recently, a small number of experts, and they didn't have a great audience. We have to realize that when something like this happens, we do have the right and should weigh up what the benefits and costs of a policy that we're being advised to go through are. But, I come back to this point about trust. Broadly speaking, the journalists have made a mistake because they've thought the public want the games they'd played before. So, for instance, there's this thing of the U-turn, which I've been critical of. In journalism, to do a U-turn is something deeply shameful, oh my gosh, you've U-turned. How could you U-turn? Well, I don't know if you drive, but U-turning is a really useful maneuver if you're about to crash, or if you're going in the wrong direction. It's like really worth doing. Much more worth doing than driving straight into the wall with your principles intact. But journalists in recent years in particular have loved this sort of game. Why have they been continuing to do this now? Only because they don't know what else to do. Now, I think this might get better, because in the coming weeks there's a much more complex debate about to happen, which is the debate around how we ease out of this as a country, and that is going to be very, very hard. And there will be a lot, because everyone's learning fast on all of this stuff. I joke about how amazed I am about the number of virologists who turn out to have been living among us in hiding all of these years. But no, I mean, to give people credit, they have mugged up on this a lot. And by the coming weeks, by the debate of the lockdown ending, there will be I think a pretty nuanced discussion about that. And it will be a matter of weighing up a very careful set of judgments. I don't envy, by the way, the politicians in Britain or anywhere else who have to make that call, because let's not beat around the bush. Our economy is screwed. I mean, we are facing. It's just, you whistle sometimes as you look at the news just come in, and it's not even near the top of the news agenda. Like 1 in 20 people lose their jobs is the news. In brief, one day, a few weeks ago, 1 in 20 people lose their jobs. We just had the Chancellor's statement yesterday. An unprecedented contraction of the British economy, and I mean, we're in really, really dangerous territory here. And I sympathise with those people who say, the sort of, what if this is all the prelude to something? What if this is all just the awful opening act, and we don't know what comes next, and that what comes next is just, we've got mass unemployment, and everyone's seeing their savings, not wiped out, but massively degraded, and so on. I mean, there's an awful lot of social upheaval to come, or could be a lot of social upheaval to come, and the politicians who have to make the judgments on that, they are making very, very fine judgments. But as I say, I'm sort of enthused by the fact that certainly in Britain there seems to be an awareness that's still holding that, the politicians are trying to do their best in very, very difficult circumstances. And that so far that public trust has held. I mean, there's been quite a lot of focus on a few people who have disregarded the official advice. But by and large, people have gone along with the government advice. And that'll probably continue. If you lose that, and that's one of the things politicians will currently be very worried about, will be if, for instance, you end the lockdown and then you get a resurgence of the virus. I mean, that's difficult, because that's the moment when you start to really risk losing public trust. But there's a lot of scenarios of doom like that.
Yeah, so I wanted to speak about this in light of the madness of crowds, because obviously at the moment there is this sort of peaceable consensus around what's going on, and very little hysteria, very little sort of this mob mentality of being vindictive or punishment. Actually, well, with it, there's been a few isolated instances, people who have been like sunbathing in the park, or things like that, and then there's been minor pylons around things like that, but it hasn't been vicious, I wouldn't say, in the way that previously it has been. No. And perhaps I wonder what in the context of that book, what your assessment is of the things at the moment and things to come. Do you think there is an opportunity, or there is the potential for that kind of hysteria around the virus and the potential lifting of the lockdown?
Yes, I mean, always. By the way, I mean, any student of history can't help finding this very interesting as we go through it. There are things that have happened in recent weeks which, are things we've read about in history, but perhaps never expected to live through and see firsthand. I mean, I've written a lot about crowd panic, but wow, to see it in action in every town is quite something. There have also been those things which are very familiar from previous crises of weird rumors breaking out. We've seen the 5G conspiracy thing, for instance, which has been fascinating. I mean, it's just extraordinary. People trying to burn down phone masts, in the belief that, this is the sort of thing that we knew and would expect to read in a history of a pandemic in the Middle Ages. But to live through it and to see even just small examples of it is as I say, I don't want to use this as a vindication of anything one previously believed, but to my mind, it's a reminder of the fact that the extent to which we progress as human beings is deeply limited. Deeply limited. I mean, we are and remain the scared beings we always have been. Susceptible, not in entirety, but susceptible in small portions, and then sometimes in a greater number, to scares. The book that the Madness of Crowds took its title from, Charles Mackay's 19th century work, Strange Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, listed examples of this. There's a huge literature on this, of how crowd scares happen. And yes, I think we're quite fortunate that we've only seen smallish outbursts of this. But you wouldn't, if there were more deaths in a country like the UK, or you wouldn't be able to trust us to be rational through this whole thing. I wouldn't anyway.
I think you just mentioning the sort of the medieval comparison to the burning of the 5G masts, and I've just realised sort of how historically we look back on that period, sort of the burning of witches and how ridiculous and ignorant and stupid that is.
Yes.
And you've just made me realise there are people going around doing, sort of burning the phone masts whilst this is going on. It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Right. And you can see exactly how these things happen. Sometimes it requires just one person to set it off. That's why there's been a certain amount of sort of clampdown in recent days in the UK, when the TV presenter Raymond Holmes just sort of said, I think we shouldn't shut down the debate. Sort of thing. And there is a very interesting free speech debate around that. I mean, I'm all for having ideas out, and that's because I believe that bad ideas will be trumped by good ideas. But nevertheless, in the short term, when people are scared, there is all sorts of irrationality that we can succumb to. It's all there. We're not magically wiser than our forebears. We're not magically braver or more rational. And if a rumor goes around, it can just sweep through.
Yeah, it's increasingly powerful in sort of the age of instant communication, instant information. Earlier, you mentioned the sort of the Trump prism through which, everything in American politics is viewed. The talking point today is this sort of the freezing of the US contributions to the World Health Organization. And I wondered if we could talk about that a little bit. First of all, whether you think that's a sensible course of action during a lethal pandemic.
Well, I don't have a strong stance on this. I see both sides on it. Firstly, the WHO is really open to an awful lot of criticism for its handling of this, principally because of the way in which it allowed China to massively mislead the globe. After all of this, when we are in a better frame of mind, there is a very significant reckoning to be had with the Chinese Communist Party that rules that country, and the manner in which it attempted to hide a pandemic that's now shut down the globe, which its actions have caused. And we should be unafraid to point fingers in that way. The WHO is certainly able to be accused, from what I've seen, of complicity in this, or at least turning a blind eye, allowing it to happen, and so on. There's just one caveat I'd say to that, which is that a lot of people in America are saying, perhaps understandably, well, this is a classic Trump diversion tactic in terms of withdrawing the funding, because obviously it means everyone's talking about that and not about his own actions. I would say the interesting thing about the Trump thing is that, various world leaders can be accused of having not taken, in fact, almost every world leader can be accused of not having taken this seriously enough until it raged. And there's lots of reasons for that. And there will be a time to litigate that and to come to some conclusions on that. Emmanuel Macron, French president, in his address to the French nation a few days ago, admitted his own culpability in that. He admitted that he had not early on in this crisis taken it seriously enough and acted fast enough. And that's very interesting because, of course, that's exactly the opposite of Trump. Now, Trump, like every other world leader, you could say, or like a lot of other world leaders in the democracies and elsewhere, did not take this seriously enough early on. But he's up for re-election later this year. And he cannot concede any weakness. That was always the case with Trump. And he certainly feels that he cannot concede that, when he was saying in February that this is, basically a flu and not much more, that was not right, So, but as I say, this is just the horror of America, which, as I say, I'm just grateful we haven't got stuck in Britain, but the horror in America is that everything is seen through this prism. And watching those press conferences in the White House every day, you're just appalled at the hollowing out of that society and the extent to which it's become this just distrustful, bipartisan, and just incapable of doing anything other than going over and over this one electoral issue. It's horrifying. I love America. It's horrifying to see that, and from the world's superpower.
That's an interesting point, particularly in relation to China, because there's 2 points here. First of all, what you were saying earlier about the accuracy, with the information being withheld in China. There's no freedom of speech, it's a closed society, isn't it? Which then raises the question of whether they actually have the pandemic under control at the moment. It's very difficult to tell.
I wouldn't believe any figures from China.
Yeah,
I've made this point before, but I don't know anyone who does business in China. I've travelled in China a certain amount, but I can't say I know the country well enough to talk with any great expertise about it from the inside. But I don't know anyone who does business in China who believes the books that they're shown by any company, any state-owned company, nobody believes the financial books, quite rightly. I wouldn't believe their figures on this for a moment. One of the strange things that your generation and mine have had is that we haven't really had to understand deeply the nature of authoritarian rule, because it hasn't been in great enough proximity to us. It was different for our parents' generation, who, even the most ignorant basically ended up realizing what communism was. Just like a generation earlier, they'd ended up having to learn the hard way what fascism was. And it is extraordinary the way in which our generation, this generation that's grown up after that, has treated the Chinese regime, for instance, as if it's like any of the others, as if it's like America or Britain, and it's just not. And maybe people will learn through this that is the case. Again, maybe they won't. I mean, I'm at risk of injecting my own hopes onto that more people realize what a regime like that rules China is actually like. But the China is doing a lot of propaganda at the moment. I mean, look at Huawei masks, Huawei labeled boxes being delivered to members of the Dutch government, receiving them off a truck and smiling and thanking Huawei representatives for this generous gift, as if this is. I mean, there's been an awful lot of that, and you see people on the left and the right sucking that up, thinking yes. And there have been very serious examples of that, by the way. The Serbian government, Serbia, of course, in recent years has been hoping to join the EU fully. And the Serbian president at the beginning of this crisis, when the EU, I think, did not respond well, received an awful lot of aid from China and gave a speech in which he said, unbelievably, our real friend is China. It is not Europe. Now, I mean, this is a catastrophe for Serbia and for Europe, but it's a fascinating move of the axis of just a part of global power. That's why I just urge that we take, when this is over, we take a really hard look at this and what China has done to the world, what it has done to our societies. I'm really up for a real reckoning on this, a real financial reckoning. And anyone who thinks that the Chinese government wouldn't do X just has no idea. I mean, no idea of what they're capable of. Some years ago, I interviewed the extraordinary Chinese dissident activist Chen Guangcheng, who's an amazing figure. And I wrote that up, I know, 7 or 8 years ago now. What Chen Guangcheng, who you remember rather dramatically escaped to he managed to escape to the American embassy in Beijing and managed to get out in an interesting diplomatic standoff. What he described the communist authorities just on a regional level as being willing to do, think of forced abortions at 9 months to enforce the one-child policy. My point is that there's nothing that they haven't been willing to do to their own population. So I go on the presumption there is nothing that they are not willing to do to the rest of the world, so long as it serves their interests.
So this is you're bringing me on to the next point I wanted to talk about. You've mentioned this hollowing out of American society, potentially the end of the American unipolar moment. Then look at Serbia, which you mentioned, that extraordinary, I agree, speech, followed up. I think Conte in Italy has said similar, because the EU, very difficult position for them. Italy, too big to fail. Like, it's not Greece, they can't abandon it. Similarly, no. What beyond potentially Eurobonds, etc., can they do to rescue it, and whether they will remains to be seen. And then all of a sudden you have China shipping medical aid, I mean all kinds of aid to these places, and there is the potential, isn't there, that China, somewhat bizarrely, even though the virus originated in Wuhan, at least as we understand it at the moment, and they could be turning this around. It could be an extraordinary political play from President Xi.
Yeah, I mean, I would simply urge everyone to do everything they can to ensure that doesn't happen. That the arsonist doesn't get praise for saving the house, you know. You mentioned Italy, by the way. I feel just so deeply sorry for the Italian people in this. It's just an unbelievable tragedy that's been going on there. And I mean, you know, the sentiment in that country in relation to it sounds ridiculous to talk about the EU when a country has been going through the horror that Italy has in recent weeks. But yes, I mean, one can understand why opinion against the EU in Italy has, you know, the anti-EU opinion that has been growing, as all the polls show. And I think those Italian politicians who said, you know, we feel abandoned, you know, are not on to nothing. I mean, the madness would be if they thought that the response to the failure of the EU was to embrace the arsonist, as I say. But maybe for some that will be seen to be some kind of short-term solution. But I mean, obviously, one would just urge them not to do that. This is just too important, and China cannot just cheaply bribe its way out of this. You know, I'm all for every option being on the table financially. You know, don't cancel the debt, don't pay any debt, write it off, just do everything. Just do everything we can to make sure they pay a price in the way that they feel, and in a way that they will feel, in a language that they understand, for causing this crash of the global economy, which, as I say, we're in the prelude to this. So many people are going to lose their jobs. So many families are going to be struggling. And, you know, this isn't like, you know, we also need to assume that we're all subtle enough to understand that this isn't an anti-Chinese point. It's a point that the Communist Party of China that rules that country cannot be allowed to get away with crashing the globe and then giving us some sweeties to help us get over it.
When you put it like that, it's pretty compelling, yeah. Some people, most notably the US president, referring to coronavirus as a Chinese virus, even a foreign virus, and being criticised for that. I mean, this is touching on, I think, your point about perhaps, you know, the barbarians are at the gate, and we'll be debating what pronoun to call it. I think it probably connects to that in a way. I mean, what's your assessment of that? Is that for you just the continuation of the culture war?
Yeah, I just think it's an example of people who don't know what to do or what to say. It's people who've never thought about pandemics, people who've never thought about this situation. They've looked at the world through one particular lens, and they'll just keep trying to do that. You know, I don't think. First of all, I mean, the point that Bill Maher made the other day that you know, we always call pandemics after the name of the place they're from. You know, whether it's Middle East respiratory syndrome, the Hong Kong flu. You know. Everything has been named after its place of origin. When somebody said the other day, well, you know, Milan was heavily hit by this, we don't call it the Milan flu. You go, yeah, but it didn't originate in Milan. You know, so there's nothing wrong with calling it the Wuhan virus or the China virus. It's accurate. I mean, you just sort of, you tear your hair out that there are people who seriously think that that's the issue. But they would only be doing that because they have nothing else to do. They're nothing else to say and no other perspective to see things. You know, the people who've been taught that the whole world can only be understood or can be best understood through race-baiting politics, of course, will be talking about words and dog whistles at this point. It just seems hell of a weak thing to be doing and a pointless thing to be doing, and you know, I just wish that they would be quiet for a moment on that. You know, as I say, that's where it comes from. I'm not adamant that we all have to call it the Wuhan virus or anything, but there's nothing racist about just mentioning that. And it's really weird seeing people still trying to play those games, you know. But as I say, I'm not worried about them. I think there's going to be very little. When all of these people across Britain lose their jobs, as household after household suffers a massive financial crisis from this, I don't think that we're going to be very interested in the race baiting academics who spend their lives talking about dog whistles. It's just like, we didn't need them before very much, if at all. We certainly don't need them now, you know.
And if there is that dampening down, as you described it earlier, the end of the culture war, if it does happen, what is it that you're going to do with your time, Douglas?
Well, I never said it was the end of it. I said
okay.
It might be
still good trade.
Down.
Still a good trade.
It might be quiet for a bit. But I'd like to think, of course, that the combination of the madness of crowds and the coronavirus saw off the identity politics movement. But I think it would be a bold prediction. Look, I mean, this stuff won't go away. It might come back with a greater vengeance. I wish it would go away. You know, I when I write about things that are aggravating and dangerous, I don't do so in the hope that they will continue for all time. You know, I do so in the hope that they will stop diverting us from doing things that waste our time. You know, I can't stress enough that, and in fact, this whole period has been, you know, it should be maybe regarded as, you know, an opportunity to reboot on some things, you know, and I think for a lot of people it has been. Certainly among friends and others I speak to, I hear this. You know, this is a moment where you can, if you want to, remind yourself of the things that actually have value in your own life. You know, instead of, you know, filling up our days with distraction, reminding ourselves of the value of the things that we regard as being valuable, the things which actually have worth. Now, that may be our families. Maybe we feel that we didn't pay enough attention to our nearest and dearest enough, and in the hubbub of the daily life and so on, we could have been better family members. Maybe we could have been better friends, and closer, and been there more for each other. Maybe we could have been better communities, better society. And maybe just as individuals, there are things we should have been doing, which this has reminded us of. You know, I mean, I've written this before, but I mean, in our lives, we fairly regularly have reminders of this. The sort of, what should I actually be doing with my life? It tends to happen when, you know, a friend or loved one dies very suddenly, or when you face a personal catastrophe, something like that. That's when you tend to ask that sort of question. But this is a moment when, as a society, it wouldn't be unwise for us to be asking that question of our society and of ourselves, and to say, actually, why don't we focus on the things that we find meaning in and lead more meaningful lives as a result? Now, this is a hell of a way to find that out. A heck of an unpleasant way for that to happen, but maybe it can happen. You know, maybe that can be the case. I, at any rate, have tried to use what spare time I have to do a lot of things, including a lot of reading and thinking about things that I've wanted to do for a long time. But I've always said, as I said, that the things I criticize, I criticize because I want them to get out of the way. I want them to get out of the way so I can get on to the things that I love and want to do. And maybe we've all got a moment like that.
Douglas Murray, that's a great place to leave it, I think. Thank you very much for your time.
It's an enormous pleasure. Thank you.